Good morning. To settle any fears of any visitors that we might have this morning, no, you haven't stumbled upon some kind of green shirt cult. This is not a rank that you reach in the congregation here. I don't know. I wasn't tricked. My wife, in our entire 15 years of marriage, has never bought me one button-up shirt ever. She's never had a hand in selecting anything that I wore on a Sunday. The last time she had any hand in a button-up shirt or anything was she was there when I got the suit for the wedding. So like that part of that process, but that was it. So when all of a sudden there's a shirt which she would never buy and she has never bought, yeah, I'm not going to be tricked. But anyway, it was pleasant though to be a part of watching the men who came in and were like, "What's going on here?" I really liked that. That was awesome. So worth coming out with the shirt myself. So happy Father's Day to all of you who are fathers, and we're going to be talking this morning about a father's hope. We talked a few weeks back when it was Mother's Day about a mother's hope, and we thought about the great potential that God has created in the work of parenting. We saw the faith of Hannah as it was transferred to her son Samuel, and how Samuel was raised, and in many ways his upbringing mirrors the upbringing that Jesus must have had, how her prayer mirrored Mary's prayer, and how it was lived out in the life of what became a good man. Parenting can really amount to a lot, and we can really have a hand in shaping the future for good. When I think about a father's hope, I'm not just going to say the same things over again. I wanted to think about a more basic, a more simple kind of hope. And think about the hope that is in every father's heart from the moment that that little boy or girl is born and that man becomes a father in reality. I remember when Ezekiel was born. I had entirely different conceptions of the way that day was going to go. I was very certain that I was going to be a Northern Hemisphere dad. I was going to have nothing to do with any of the nitty-gritty of childbirth. I was, in fact, telling Chantel that I wanted to be the guy out in the waiting room, and slapping the backs of the other dads who were there and all that kind of stuff. But we had Ezekiel in Australia, and if you know anything about Australians, and in particular Australian midwives, that was never going to be an option. They were barking orders from the moment that we got in there to me, and it was yes ma'am, and I just did exactly what I was told. But as I became very connected with that process, I'm glad that I was. It was an amazing experience. I know that Chantel did all the work, but I got through and I felt like I'd run a marathon. So it was just an amazing experience to be a part of all of that. And yet it was not without difficulty. Chantel gave birth to Ezekiel. She didn't have any an epidural or any of that kind of stuff, but she did have Pitocin, and there were some dramatic circumstances surrounding Ezekiel's coming. They thought the water had broken. The water hadn't actually broken. They gave her Pitocin. There's all kinds of things going on. And to complicate matters, when he was actually coming out, he had his hand like that. So he was just really, really stuck in there. He's got a big head. I'm sorry to my wife for the Swain genes and our large craniums, but it was just a challenge. And as she labored, and that labor was very intense, his heart rate was fluctuating, and it was just getting to be quite dramatic. They had to take some extra steps to get Ezekiel to come out. And I remember when he came out, how happy I was. I very happily became the dad who went from, not even wanting to be in the room really, but the dad who cut the cord, and the dad who really wanted to embrace my newborn son. Then they took him over to this machine. They had this newfangled, as James might like me to describe it, machine to test the vitals of the newborn baby. And like all wonderful hospital inventions, it didn't work at all. They put Ezekiel on this machine, and rather than giving, as we envision it, giving Ezekiel right to mom to have that initial bond, took him over to this machine to check his vitals because of the circumstances of the birth. And while he's there, he's screaming. This machine is just blaring, and all these alarms are going off because it's not working properly. And I felt just this welling up inside of me of really something that I hadn't experienced before. It was a mixture of anger and frustration and an intense desire to protect. And I just really did not want whatever that machine in my mind was doing to my son to happen. And as politely and as sternly as I could, though, I said, can you just give us our son? And I remember saying that, and just the feelings that were inside of me at that moment. I wanted my boy to be safe, and being safe was with mom, and protected from others. Fathers hope for their children's safety. You can see that in David, right? He says, is the young man Absalom safe? If you didn't know about this Bible account before it was read to you, David is Absalom's father, and the circumstances of this question are actually really, really dramatic. David is in the midst of a civil war. He is actually a king on the run. He's in the forest, and his forces are engaging the forces of his people on the other side of the equation. They have fought each other, and you would think that at the forefront of his mind in the midst of the civil war was maybe his reign, his own status as king. But no, none of those things came to his mind. He only wanted to know how his son was doing in the conflict. His son was involved. And so he says, not how do the armies fare or how is the battle going? He says, is the young man Absalom safe? Is the young man Absalom safe? I want us to think about a couple of things this morning. We're going to dwell on this story for a little bit and think about some things relative to, first of all, David's timing. And then we're going to see some wisdom that came later from someone else who is related to David that I think is going to help us to perhaps have better timing. So let's think about David's timing. Let's think about when he asked the question, is the young man Absalom safe? You look at that and you say, well, of course. I mean, of course, at the forefront of his mind, if there was a conflict, matters of national interest would be set aside for any parent. You would think about your son. You would think about your child. But the circumstances of this are a little bit more complicated than what I have already shared. And some of you already know this, but for those who don't, Absalom is actually on the other side of the equation from David. He is on the other side of this civil war. Absalom has usurped David's throne, and he's the one who's put David on the run. He's the one who has committed his forces to going into the forest there and to finding his father, finding all who support his father, and killing all of them. So that's what Absalom wants to do to his dad. And so those are the circumstances that surround this. It's amazing how much a father hopes for his son's safety, because David still hopes for his son's safety, even when his son obviously doesn't want his, even when his son is seeking for his life. In fact, David cares more for his son than he cared for his kingdom and all of the citizens in it. When he gets this news, we're going to continue the reading here in 2 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 33. You know, he was expecting and looking for good news, but there was only one question that came from his lips: is the young man Absalom safe? And when he finds out that he is not safe, but in fact he has died, the Cushite probably thought that he was delivering to David good news when he said in verse 32, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do you harm be like that young man. In other words, he's dead. When he hears this from the Cushite, it says in verse 33, the king was deeply moved. He went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said this, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place, O Absalom, my son, my son." It actually, it doesn't stop there. He keeps grieving. Even when the victory sound goes out and everyone becomes aware of how the battle has gone in David's favor and David's forces have won out against the forces on the other side, Continues in verse number 4, the king covers his face, and the king cries out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom, Absalom, my son, my son." Joab, David's general, has to come to him and give him a proverbial slap in the face. The scripture doesn't record it, but maybe a real one. As he says in verse number 5, "Today you have disgraced all your servants who today have saved your life, the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives, and the lives of your concubines." You wanted Absalom's safety, but do you realize what would have happened had he won? You'd be dead, they'd be dead, we'd all be dead. And so in verse number 6, he says, "In that you love your enemies and hate your friends. For you have declared today that you regard neither princes nor servants. For today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and if all of us had died today, then it would have pleased you well." You say, David just wasn't thinking right. Kids have a way of doing that, don't they? Moms and dads. They have a way of getting us to really not think right. But this question might surprise you. I need to ask it. Did he really care? Did he really care? Of course he did. Of course he wanted his son's safety. No, did he really care? You see, children have a way of evoking emotions that arise from within us without any logic or any reason. I have 4 kids, and you guys all know those 4 kids if you've been here any length of time. But you might not know this about the third child. You might already know it. But the third child, when he came along, I knew that he could not be the baby. He just had too many baby traits that could be exploited if he were allowed to be the baby. He could not be the baby. When he was, just a few months back, in fact, he hasn't done this in a little while, but he just had this way of coming to you, and you're sitting there doing something on the couch or whatever. He comes to you and he puts one little hand on this side of your face, and the other little hand on this side of your face, and he turns your face to him and he says, "Cookies." And he used to do things like that, and if you're parenting from a viewpoint of emotion, well, of course, cookies. Of course you can have cookies. But if you're parenting from a place of logic and reason, you'll think, wait a minute, you didn't finish your breakfast. There is still food on the table that you're supposed to eat, and it's breakfast. You don't get cookies for breakfast. If you're thinking properly, then you evaluate that circumstance, and you express care that is actually going to be helpful. But children have a way of separating us from what is helpful or beneficial and getting us to think that what is helpful or beneficial is merely what they think is good. Absalom wanted to be king, and in David's heart, he didn't want to fight it. Why can't David be king? Parenting from a place of emotion, he didn't reflect upon some of the things that he understood about what it was to be God's king. You saw how much he respected the position when he was on the run from Saul, who was at that time king. The Lord's anointed. Well, he was the Lord's anointed. Absalom was doing something that was totally wrong and sinful, in addition to doing something against him personally. And yet, parenting from a place of emotion, he didn't see that. And so if we parent from a place of emotion, you really have to ask the question, do we really care? And unfortunately, the answer is no. But there's more to the story than this. As we think about Absalom and his safety, there were times where David could have asked that question, and it would have been beneficial. But David did not seek Absalom's safety on a number of occasions. See, Absalom doesn't just all of a sudden say, "I'm king, and get out of here, Dad, I'm going to kill you." That doesn't just happen in a vacuum. There are a series of events that lead to that. And if you're a student of the text, you're aware of this, but I want to highlight it for those, for your benefit maybe, and for those who haven't studied this text before. But Absalom, there were a series of tragedies that lead to him doing what he does, and a series of poor decisions on David's part that also contribute. When Absalom's half-brother Amnon raped his sister Tamar, the soap operas of the modern world have nothing on the biblical account, and the depravity that sometimes people will find themselves subject to or a party of. This happens in David's own household. And what does David do on this occasion? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. He does not respond in any way to what his son has done. And meanwhile, Tamar's full brother, Absalom, watches as his half-brother, Amnon, has done all of this. Absalom watches all of this, and it sits with him, and it sits with him. 2 full years, David does absolutely nothing. And so Absalom takes it into his own hands. He says, I'm going to do something. He has a feast, and he invites all of his family. And there at the feast, he orders his soldiers to kill Amnon. And what did David do? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Absalom goes on the run. He flees to a foreign country. The man who actually steps in here, Joab, to actually try to knock some sense into David, he has all kinds of bad ideas at that point. He says, what's the good of, he's a man who probably would have, if it were his brother that had raped his sister or something, he probably would have done the same thing. Joab's a bad dude. But Joab, he says to David, you got to bring this guy back. You got to bring Absalom back. And so Absalom is brought back into the kingdom, but in a very, very weird way. David says, all right, Absalom can come back into the kingdom, but he will not see my face. You know, parents who have ever dealt with a child who has fallen away from the faith, this is a lesson that you really need to listen to, because you can kind of do something like this. I've seen it happen before. Where on the one hand, you want to hold your child accountable for his or her behavior, but on the other hand, you don't want them to face the penalty of what it is that they are doing. You don't want them to have to be in the far country by themselves, to find themselves in the pig pen. And so you give them this kind of half in, half out, half restrictive, half not. We're not forgiving, but we want to forgive. And this weird thing that happens here where there's not reconciliation, but there is reconciliation. And you know, the product of all of that is just not going to work. It didn't work for Absalom. And so while he's sitting there in the city of Jerusalem, not allowed to go into the king's house, he sits there and he sees these people coming, and an idea gets into his head. And he says, what if I were king? What if that were my house? And he starts to talk to people and get people on his side. And before you know it, Absalom has declared himself to be king, and David doesn't do anything. There really wasn't much to this claim initially. There were just a few people who were with him. David could have responded, but he does nothing and he leaves. I would suggest that in all of those things, David was not seeking his son's safety. He was not doing what had to be done or what was dictated by logic. But you could argue that there is also more to the story. You see, why isn't David doing anything in all of these occasions? Why isn't he parenting? Why isn't he doing something when Amnon rapes Tamar? Why isn't he doing something when Absalom kills Amnon? Why isn't he doing something to affect a real repentance on Absalom's part, a real opportunity for him to be brought back into the kingdom? Why isn't he doing anything when Absalom declares himself to be king? Maybe it's because he doesn't think he has the right to. You see, sometimes as parents, we fail terribly. We fail terribly. We make terrible decisions. And we allow those decisions to snowball to the point where we don't ever do anything in parenting. And effectively, as Jesus unfortunately said of the Jews, another father steps in. Jesus said in John chapter 8 to the Jews, you are of your father, the devil, and the lusts of your father you will do. The devil is a good parent. And when we have given in to his temptations, his wiles, and when we think we no longer have the right perhaps to parent, he's going to step in. See, there were a number of times when David could have done something different in his life and maybe not gotten to that point of true despair. You see, when he sinned with Bathsheba, we talked about that last Sunday morning, how that begins because of an unwise decision. He doesn't go out to battle. All the kings are going out to battle. He looks out the window. He sees this woman. He could have ended it right there. It didn't have to go anywhere. He didn't have to dwell upon that thought, and he certainly didn't have to act on it. And that, unfortunately, though, leads to adultery. He tries to cover up that sin by murdering Uriah. But even if you go back further in David's life, what if he had honored what marriage was supposed to be? He wrote, I believe, Psalm 119, 172 verses praising the first 5 books of the Bible. Let me be honest, when was the last time you wrote a poem about how great Leviticus was? Anybody ever done that? But he does that. He praises the first 5 books of the Bible. 172 verses of in the Hebrew language. You got this beautiful alliteration that happens, 8 verses at a time, moving through the Hebrew alphabet, letter by letter, and it's just this beautiful work of art, praising the Word of God. And yet, maybe if Jesus were to have seen David at various points in his life, he might have asked him the question that he asked the Pharisees and the scribes of his day. Haven't you read? Haven't you read that God made them at the beginning male and female? David had read that. He loved it. He praised it, but he didn't live it. And at none of those times, therefore, was he seeking his child's safety. We can make different decisions about our own faith and seek our child's safety in so doing. But then number 2, even if we fail in these ways, we can still seek our child's safety by parenting. I want to draw 3 points out of this before I turn this lesson into something a lot more positive, I hope. Number 1, there's going to come a time when it's too late to seek your child's safety. I really don't know when that is. I don't know when that's going to happen. I don't know if it's going to be when your child dies, or I don't know if it's going to be when your child has such a hard heart that they will no longer change. Sometimes that happens. A conscience can be so seared with a hot iron that people just don't change. Don't give up hope if your child is alive. Don't give up hope upon what God can do in a person's life. But at the same time, there is going to come a time when it's too late. Number 2, if you're not seeking for souls to be safe, then you're not seeking safety at all. David wanted Absalom's physical safety, but clearly in all of these decisions he made, he did not want Absalom's spiritual safety. That's got to be at the forefront of our minds. That's the only thing that matters. My sons, I want them to have a good relationship with money. I want them to have hardworking jobs, but I really don't care what they do for a living, and I don't care how much money they have. I would love it if Proverbs 30 and Agar's prayer was lived out in their lives. Give me neither poverty nor riches. That's what I want for myself. That's what I want for my boys, because I know that there are temptations on either side of the spectrum. And so I just want them to have what they need in the moment, and I want God to provide for them, and I know that He will, but I know what that needs, what needs to be in place in their lives in order for God to provide for them is seeking the kingdom first. That's what I want for my boys. That's it. That's success, and that's it. And so if you're not seeking the safety of souls, you're not seeking safety at all. What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? We've got to ask that question sometimes as parents. There is nothing more precious than the souls of my children, because there's nothing that they can give or I can give in exchange for their souls. And then number 3, it's better to seek safety today than it is tomorrow. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 1 says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Well, here's the thing about you, and here's the thing about your children. They are younger today than they will be tomorrow. You are younger today than you will be tomorrow. And so today is the day to do something positively as a parent. So let's turn the page, and let's talk about seeking some safety for our children. You see, God does something really amazing. He has a way of doing that, doesn't He? Something really amazing with the series of tragedies that lead to this terrible circumstance surrounding Absalom. You see, David, all of this, you could argue, begins for David, this poor series of choices in life and then in parenting begin with this terrible sin that he commits with Bathsheba. Well, Bathsheba's husband dies, Uriah, obviously by David's command. And then, as Romans chapter 7 says, she's not married anymore. And David marries her. A child is born from that marriage. The first child, of course, dies. The second child, Solomon. Now, Solomon was not a great parent. We know that from the fruit of his parenting in Rehoboam. But what he was someone that God wanted to use, perhaps in a story of contrast, to teach us about parenting. For those who were here at the beginning of the year, I'm going to be covering some of the same ground, but I'm doing this both for your review and for the benefit of those who weren't a part of this class, I want us to see that God doesn't want us to be untethered parents. He doesn't want us to be parents who are guided by our children's emotions or by our own whims. He wants to teach us about how to parent. And so he used this man, Solomon, that again, in his life and in his parents' lives and his sons' lives, loudly speak to how parenting can go wrong. He used this man to teach us about how parenting can go right. The book of Proverbs really ought to be the best friend of anyone who is seeking to save the soul of a child, because it's a book that's actually set up, it's sandwiched with the thought of parenting. Chapters 1 through 9 are the father's advice to his son. Chapter 31 is a son recounting the advice of his mother. I think all that's purposeful. You look at Proverbs as a book of random bits of wisdom, like a set of Chinese fortune cookies. You're not looking at it properly. It's a book about parenting. And it's a book that's designed to get us to see some things about parenting. I want to show you a few of those things, and again, just hopefully whet your appetite. It teaches us about parenting, that parenting needs to be a united work. Yes, the majority speaker in the book is the father. But the father is not alone in what he speaks. And let's see it in Proverbs chapter 1, beginning. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8, and I'm going to read these verses back to back so that you can see what is repeated. In Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8, "My son, hear the instruction of your father. Do not forsake the law of your mother." Chapter 6 and verse 20, it says, "My son, keep your father's command. Do not forsake the law of your mother." Chapter 10 and verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, "A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the grief of his mother." Chapter 15 and verse number 20, it says, "A wise son makes his father glad, but a foolish man despises his mother." Chapter 23 and verse number 22, it says, in verse number 22, "Listen to your father who begot you, and do not despise your mother when she is old." What do you notice about each of those verses? Did you see how the father and the mother are used interchangeably? Why is that? Because when we're doing it God's way, Mom and Dad, we're saying the same things as each other. We are doing this together. We are presenting a united front. And notice how it is always Mom and Dad. It's not the temple from the Old Testament point of view. Or from the New Testament view, it's not the church or the elders, it's not the teachers, it's not the friends, it's not the peers, it's certainly not the school system. Over and over again, it's mom and dad who are implanting these things into the hearts of their children. And that is, again, by God's design. Now, I know it's not always the case that mom or dad, relative to the way things are right now, can do what these verses say. Mom or dad might not be in the picture. Mom or dad might not be in the faith. And church, we need to be aware of those circumstances. You wonder what a lesson like this has to do with people who don't have kids. This is what it has to do with kids. You've got to step in when mom or dad isn't doing what mom or dad should be doing. You know, I speak from experience. I came from a background where at various points mom or dad weren't in the church. But who was in my life when they weren't in my life spiritually? The church was. The church stepped in, and I had fathers, more fathers than I can count in my life. And you know that's an opportunity. You have to rise to that occasion. But still, if you're thinking about this on this side of the equation, you're thinking about dating somebody, you're thinking about marrying somebody, you ask the question, could what I say be interchanged with what she or he says? It needs to be that way. Consistency is key. In the teaching of mom and dad, you see the word Torah used. And this is not in relation to the Torah, the law of God. It's in relation to the consistency of their teaching, the law of your father, the law of your mother. And so that's what needs to come from us. We need to teach in a consistent fashion. Little things over time make big changes, but if you don't have consistency in those little things, they will never amount to anything major. Now, some other lessons from the proverbial father of the text. He taught by example in chapter 4 and verse 11. Chapter 4 and verse 11. It says, "I have taught you in the way of wisdom," but notice, I have led you in right paths. Our example teaches when our words don't. How often have you seen your children do what you said, but not what you did? I mean, I shared this in the parenting class, and it's something that I've caught myself in a few times, but I guess it's one way to handle frustration. But when I'm frustrated, I go, do that. Figure that's better than some other things that I could do. But you know what I see the little boys doing? The very same thing. Okay, lesson learned. They're watching. I never told them to do that, but they're doing it. Okay, they're watching. We teach by our example. Number two, therefore, we ought to teach by example and demonstrate by example our dependence upon God. What beautiful thoughts in chapter 3 and verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the increase of all, or the first fruits of all your increase. So your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. How often have our children seen us trust in the Lord with all of our hearts? How often has that been lived out in what we've done, what we've sacrificed, what we've given? Because again, we are teaching by example. Number three, the proverbial father made wisdom very attractive. One of the things that you will notice in reading chapters 1 through 9 of the book of Proverbs is how often dad portrays wisdom, a thing, as a woman. Like in chapter 3 and verse 13, happy is the man who finds wisdom, the man who gains understanding, for her proceeds are better. What do you think that's all about? Anyone who's a guy knows what it's all about. You know, you grow up, and there comes a time when girls don't have cooties anymore, and they're pretty. Well, dad says to his son, there's a woman that you want in your life. The first and foremost woman in your life. Let me tell you about her. Her name is wisdom. Let me tell you what she's going to bring into your life. He made wisdom attractive to his son. He brought wisdom into life. Go to the ant, you sluggard, chapter 6 and verse 6. What's that all about? It's about a dad being aware of the situation. Yes, being aware of what his child needs to know, but being aware of what God is providing to teach. And God gives innumerable messages in creation. If you keep your eyes open, you'll see all of the time what God is showing you. Illustrations, teaching points, where you can bring God to life in the eyes of those children. They need to see that because wisdom is real. And then you're going to see dad doing something that dads unfortunately don't do enough these days. Dad talks about life-shaping decisions openly and honestly. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, what's he talking about? And what does he talk about over and over again in these 9 chapters? He talks about not just lady wisdom, but the woman you're going to marry and the woman you don't want to marry and the woman you don't want to have in your life. In chapter 5, verse 1, pay attention, son. Lend your ear to my understanding. Let me preserve your discretion. Let your lips keep knowledge. For the lips of an immoral woman drip honey. An immoral, a strange, a foreign woman, a woman that you don't want to have in your life, literally. He teaches his son, rather, who she is so that he can avoid her, so that he can find someone different. The proverbial father doesn't have to worry about the birds and the bees because he's always talking about these things frankly, openly, and honestly. Now, I hope that this has piqued your interest, because that's really all I can do on a Sunday morning when it's hot and I know I need to wrap up. But I want to say this one last thing about the exercise of parenting. When it comes to getting wisdom in your home, when it comes to you, dad, being who you need to be, you need to understand something about this. Done is better than perfect. I had the parents downstairs say this. I need to have everyone here say this. Can we all say it together? Done is better than perfect. Because what your kids need more than you crafting a perfect devotional every single night that has relevant and applicable information for their life at that exact moment, more so than you saying the exact perfect prayer, and more so than you doing everything that they need at that exact moment in the right way, perfectly for their spiritual edification and benefit. What they need more than anything is for you just to do something. Because you're not perfect. I can talk about David's failures as a man. I could talk about his failures as a parent. But if I'm honest, I could talk about my failures as a man. And I could talk about my failures as a parent. Our failures can make us feel like we can't do anything. And they should remind us that we're not going to do anything perfectly, but hopefully they will then remind us that we are supposed to be trusting in the Lord with all of our heart and leaning not on our own understanding, right? And that we serve a perfect God. And so all I need to do is, in my own feeble, imperfect way, point them to Him. That's it. And that's so simple. When I realized that, I just got a bunch of books on my shelf, and it's very simple. At the end of the day, we gather the kids around, we pull a book off a shelf, we read it. Sometimes those books are imperfect. Sometimes I make some corrections. That's okay. And we go around the room and we say, what do you want to thank God for today? What's God done for you today? It's simple. It's not earth-shattering, but it's soul-shaping. And over time, as you apply yourself to just doing something, you're going to see that God is able to take little, insignificant, imperfect things and do great things. Is my child safe? Is every father's hope. Dads, we want our children to be safe. We want that from the moment that they come out of the womb, before they come out of the womb. I can't tell you how nervous I was when Chantel was pregnant, and how much that feeling of being nervous just amplified all the more when Ezekiel was born. That welling desire to keep my son safe. Well, there's no safety that's more important than the safety of a soul. No safety. In fact, there is no safety if the soul's not safe. Dads, can we help you this morning? Moms, can we help you? If you're on the outside of this equation, is there any help that you can give to moms and dads? Is there any help that you can give to what you see in these pews, the future of the church in these young faces? Commit to being what these children need, and commit to asking God for any help that you need in so doing. If you have any need, let me know while we stand and sing the song of invitation.